Welcome to OTR Presents A Friendly Debate, the show where lawyers debate topics ranging from music to philosophy and everything in between. Our lawyerly debaters will face off in impassioned arguments about entirely subjective topics, and the moderator decides the winner arbitrarily, where the only prize is bragging rights and maybe a point or two. We aim to change the hearts and minds of our listeners, but ultimately fall short every time. My name is Mucci, and I will be moderating and leading us through this episode. I am a personal injury attorney with little to no judicial experience, but I think I can be fair and impartial here. Our debaters are geared up and ready to go. They've been talking a bit of trash before tonight's episode, but I've managed to keep them civil to save it all for tonight. They have major opinions on who's better, the Beatles or the Rolling Stones, and that's our topic for this first episode. Now let's meet our debaters. Having attended Harvard High School and seeing this issue from his high-rise condo, our first debater, Lando. Lando has decided, in his prosecutorial discretion, that the Stones shall be charged with being so beneath the Beatles that they're not even worth mentioning in the same breath as the Fab Four. And he'll be facing off against the Rubber City's own Pat, a man who once paid for a Tidal premium account, I guess to listen to Mick and Keith in high def. Pat will be using his IP experience to argue the Beatles hold the patent for mediocrity. So how are you guys feeling? Any pre-debate nerves?
None at all. I think we've just been sorting that out in the group chat before this. I was kind of worried, in fact, that we were just going to get all the issues out and laid bare and that wouldn't have any material left over for tonight. But I remain very confident that I can prove my case for the Beatles being awful and the Stones being, a much more worthy example of music.
Wow, awful. What do you think?
You can't even really say it with a straight face.
That's just how I look. What have you got to say for yourself, Mr. Fab Four?
He doesn't even buy it himself. I don't know how he's going to get through this.
Well,
somebody sounds like he's got some nerves.
I'm completely
Deflection?
Fine. I'm completely fine here.
Well, let me just explain for the listeners how the breakdown of this will go. So this is what the breakdown's always going to be. A brief opening statement from each side, followed by questioning by me, where I'll allow them a bit of back and forth, and after a series of questioning, we'll end with closing arguments, followed by a final decision by me. And just to disclose my personal biases on this issue, I actually love both bands. They're actually my top two favorite bands. But I do lean toward the Stones, just to let you know where my bias is. However, whenever the Beatles and their contributions to music are discussed, it's hard for me not to view them as the better band in a lot of ways. So, while I may prefer the Stones, it is possible that at the end of this, I might come out on the side of the Beatles, but we'll see. Anything else before we get started with opening arguments?
No, I think I'm ready to go. Let's do this.
Yeah, I'm good.
All right, let's flip the coin and see who goes first. Who wants to call it?
Just point each other. I'll call it.
You can't point. It's an audio medium. So, Pat, you'll call it in the air? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Heads or tails?
Tails.
And it's tails.
Well, both the Beats and the Stones have their origin in jazz and blues. I think only one of them pursued it with any sense of sincerity and thereby sense of authenticity. While the Beatles represent the whitewashed version of this rich cultured heritage, I think that the Stones, really kept what those originally represented, what those musical roots represented, and by that they kept the edge that came along with it, the inherent, underground sense of blues and jazz, and so by revitalizing those roots, extending them instead of trimming them, you might say, as the Beatles had done, the Stones created the template for all rock music that would follow. And I have to admit, even my least favorite band of all time, AC/DC, and you can ask our friend Derek, I fucking hate that band, they do kind of follow in the steps of the Stones, who I like a lot. And so, given that the inspiration has touched, bands that I like and even the ones I hate, that breadth speaks to something of, what the Stones were able to achieve. So I think that fundamentally, the difference between the Stones and the Beatles is laid bare by this lens. Which of these bands has a happy birthday song and a Christmas song? It sure as shit isn't the Stones. Do you have anything to say, Orlando?
Counsel, this is opening statements. It's entirely improper.
Again, I have, if I'm ever in court in my job, that's because I've done something horribly wrong.
Clearly.
Yeah.
All right, thank you, Pat. And
You're welcome.
And now, Orlando, are you ready for your opening?
Yes, absolutely.
Go ahead.
So tonight we're discussing a topic that is really a non-debate.
And yet you're on this show?
There's only one clear answer in terms of who the better band is. Better in the sense of lyrics, music, and influence. Around the world, I might add. So what makes the Beatles a better band than the Rolling Stones? Well, of the definable attributes, statistics, and content of the Beatles that make them absolute legends, from outselling the Rolling Stones in album sales, to having amassed a larger following on social media, to becoming involved in the film world, they were and are still a force that no one can take down. But apart from that, there's a certain magic to them that is completely real, but also undefinable and hard to place. It's there that their music, as well as their personality, move people to become hysterical when attending a show. It's there that their lyrics and melodies move individuals to tears. So, if it's more than just a matter of which band can be pinned to having won more awards, sold more albums, or have had more hits, all the Beatles, by the way. If it's more than just that, then the massive craze that the Beatles brought over when they first came to the US with their bowl-cut hair, shaking their heads as they played, that should be an indicator of who made the bigger social impact. The demand for the Beatles to make films and be the subject of countless documentaries, as well as actual movies about their music, should be an indicator of their social impact. And the simple fact that they withstood the test of time after not being around for decades, performing live only a handful of years, while their so-called competition in this debate has had plenty of opportunity to stay relevant, or, I guess, attempt to stay relevant, this entire time, is a huge indicator as to who made the bigger social impact. On top of all that, the Beatles are always held to a higher standard. I would bet my law degree that if we took a poll on the streets of our beautiful Chicago, I know that most people would say that the Beatles were a better band. Maybe the Stones would get a 10% polling there. And I know that
10%.
Each of you, in your hearts, know this. And I'm pretty sure that the Rolling Stones know this as well.
I think it'd be more of like 1% of 1% of 1%. Okay, thanks, guys. So, I think I'll start with the first question I have here.
You mean we can't just start flinging verbal insults? We actually have to...
Well, let me guide you a little bit.
Okay.
So, my first question is, where would popular music be without your favorite band? Who was more influential and innovative, and in which ways did they change music?
Oh, wow. Can you imagine a world without any sense of modern rock? Because that's what you'd be living in without the Stones. You'd be listening to the fucking Monkees or something.
Which is not bad at all.
Hey, we're the Monkees.
Absolutely.
And we like to monkey around. I mean, come on. Any good music has... It follows the format of the Stones. It has those guitars, has energy behind the vocals that's completely lacking from the Beatles.
Any basic rock band has that formula that you're talking about, and we would be perfectly fine without the Rolling Stones.
Well, I don't agree with that.
Well,
but
fine, man.
I think that I don't agree with what Orlando said there, but
I was just being a little dramatic, but I mean that's kind of
Right.
how I feel.
We're just two dramatic guys.
Maybe
wild and dramatic guys.
Well, maybe that's the thing. Maybe you can like localize the Stones' influence to just rock, whereas the Beatles' influence can be seen more broadly in pop in general, and rock, and many other genres. What do you think about that?
So this is kind of what I was going to get at. I read a couple articles. I'm not going to directly quote anything because I'm not going to directly quote anything because I don't remember which ones I was reading and who wrote them and all that stuff. But I mean, there is such a thing as the Rolling Stones copying the Beatles, and once the Beatles kind of stroll out of the music scene, then the Rolling Stones kind of go on their downward spiral to nowhere. So, I mean, if we're talking about influence...
Downward spiral? Are you talking about the Nine Inch Nails?
Yeah, we can talk about that next.
Stones copying the Beatles? You're funny, man.
You can even... I'm pretty sure Mick Jagger was quoted on that. But,
Do you have a quote?
I don't.
I'm pretty sure he was quoted, though.
I'm glad I pushed you on that. So, I think that's a fair point. As far as pop music, sure, the Beatles, I think, have the influence there, but... I mean,
I will say so the Stones were a cover band first.
Yeah.
So when the
Berry,
Beatles when the Beatles were doing their thing and they started blowing when they were right, but when they were blowing up, the Stones were a cover band, and when a couple of the Beatles' big albums, the Stones kind of did something in retaliation to what the Beatles did, and it was very similar. I mean,
but.
I don't have the exact years, but I know what you're talking. I know you know what I'm talking about.
The 60s was so crazy though because
everybody was on drugs and.
Well, the Beatles maybe beat the Stones kind of by about a year, and then like a year later, the Stones released their first album, and they're kind of ahead just by like a year every time. But then the Stones do like kind of. I mean, they always had their own voice, but I think they definitely find even more so their own voice even after the Beatles break because the Beatles were just ahead. In terms of that, they were
in terms of musical ability, lyrical.
I want to circle back to something here because I sensed a bit of denigration when you're talking about the Stones starting out as a cover band. I mean, you had musicians here. I mean, the initial concept for it was going to be a jazz and blues band, and so they were doing covers of jazz and blues artists
like
that
blues
they
standards. They're like a kind of a blues
they respected
at first.
Yeah, and so that's what I'm saying that like. Instead of just drawing from it, those are the songs they wanted to play. They are bathed in this jazz and blues scene that they incorporate to their own music.
Yeah,
I think that the Beatles then are just purely derivative
of
those roots. They whitewash it to make it more appealing to a broader audience. But I think that the Stones, in that sense, actually have some authenticity.
More authentic. There was I can't remember who said this quote, but some like famous blues musician. Black.
We really gotta get our facts straight.
Well, we really do because
look for that.
I wasn't the one to be calling them a cover band. I just remember, someone was calling them.
Oh, now you're backpedaling. Now you're backpedaling.
And apparently that person was Mick Jagger. but anyway,
yes, I am a cover.
A well-known,
Michael Jagger,
a well-regarded black blues musician. This was his review of the Stones. Was those white boys want to play blues so badly, and they do. So badly. Which I thought was a pretty good quote.
Who said that?
I don't know. We'll add it in post. Okay?
As you can tell, we have prepared very thoroughly for this.
I was the one that had to prepare that stuff. I just remember it from... So you're talking about authenticity. And Orlando, you've mentioned a few times better lyrics. So just to have both of you, like, make a case for your band's lyricism.
Do you want to at least pick like one song? Because I think talking about a whole catalog, we're just going to be saying, mine's the favorite. No, mine's the favorite. Is there like a song in particular that you think is emblematic of the Beatles songwriting?
Are there lyrics that you particularly love from a particular song?
So I'll give you a personal story as to this one song. I don't know if you've heard it or not. Let It Be. Do you guys hear that song?
Familiar with that one?
Yeah. You know that song?
Yeah.
So I'll be the first to admit, if I hear that song and I'm just driving along in my car, I will shed a single tear. That every single time I hear that song, it seriously brings something out of me. I have no idea why.
We're just dramatic guys.
And I know I'm not the only one. And
are you the only one in this room, Mucci?
Granted, I know nothing about the Rolling Stones. I know a song because of Martin Scorsese, and that's the only freaking reason why. But they do not, they rise no emotion out of me. I could.
I mean, I think if you had listened to more Stones, there are more Stones songs that would.
Yeah. Wild Horses, come on.
Yeah,
I was more upset when Leo DiCaprio died in The Departed than any time I heard the Rolling Stones in one of those movies.
Departed. But is there a particular lyric that you really like from that song, or is it more of
Is it
Paul's
the phrase
vocal,
"Let It Be"?
It's just everything.
vocal
It's just
performance of it?
everything.
Or okay, but strictly lyricism, would you know, is there like a line that you love from that song, or just generally that's the lyrics bring something out in you, emotion, right? Or is that
Right, and I don't, you make it seem like I'm the only one, and I know I'm not the only one.
Of course,
here.
yeah. I mean, Let It Be is a pretty.
You're starting to cry right now, so I know I'm not the only one.
What about you, Pat?
So
Exactly.
I want to come from the
Rolling
perspective.
Stones song.
I want to come from the perspective here that like I grew up like my dad had the, Beatles CD that we'd put in our fucking minivan when we were going on road trips and stuff. So I grew up like listening to it, but like maybe it's just because of pure saturation. Nothing ever did like Let It Be never had like that great emotional impact for me. But I from my parents' old record collection, they have a copy of Sticky Fingers. Which, of course, the zipper's been ripped off the cover of it by now.
I think I actually have that album on vinyl, too. Or maybe that's you, Mucci.
I have it. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, I have
maybe
it.
that's why I just keep on seeing it.
I don't have any Beatles albums in my collection.
I have those.
Anyway, so I getting back to like music my parents listened to and stuff, I listened to that a couple times, and yeah, like stuff like Wild Horses, like just it's the lyrics, but of course always the way they're presented.
Yeah.
And so, I think Wild Horses is a somewhat simple song, but the emotion that can be put to those words, I think that does it for me. If you're talking like about a sentimental song, Wild Horses puts me right in the mood, and it's one of their slower ones. I have.
You can't play it if you're trying to play it.
No.
We don't own the.
We
We can't
bleep
afford
this
that.
out. It's like I have some data here. So what I went through, and I'm going to probably come back to this later. I found like lists like top 10 Beatles songs, top 10 Rolling Stones songs, and looked at the BPM for them. And so Wild Horses and say Angie. Wild Horses is 74 BPM. Angie's 68.
Can you explain what that means?
Beats per minute.
Okay, thank
Sense
you. I
of
just wanted
how
to make sure
fast or
someone
slow a song is, and so
listening would know.
like you can listen to Angie, which is like kind of has that very kind of thought, plodding pace to it, I guess is the word. I don't know. It kind of chugs along a little bit. Wild Horses is a little bit faster at 74, but Let It Be is probably like 65 or so. It seems right. It's slower, and so for those more sentimental songs, I don't know. Am I arguing here just from a perspective that okay, it's similarly slow, it's just personal preference, personal experience that Wild Horses does it for me, but get into the story here that Wild Horses can tear me away. It's about love, it's about longing, committing to one another, and I don't know, I probably should have taken the time now to print them out so we can mark it up or something. But.
So it's kind of, if you're going Wild Horses to Let It Be, it's sort of let's do some living after we die versus when I find myself in times of trouble, Mother Mary comes to me speaking words of wisdom.
Finish it.
Let it be.
Thank you. Is this like a nostalgia kind of thing though? You said you're talking about it like as this is
No, not at all. I don't think of
when
my
you
mom.
were younger.
No, I listened to the Beatles when I was younger. That's what I was saying. It's just been pounded into my head like a nail that it just has lost all meaning. I'd love to, relate to the idea of feeling moved by Let It Be, but for me it's just such a bland song.
Maybe Taxman is more your speed.
Yeah.
Maybe a high BPM on that one.
Yeah.
So I'd like to maybe turn to longevity versus... Well, okay, so the Beatles have a famously short career and did a lot in that short amount of time, and the Stones have been around for almost 60 years now. So I have some questions relating to longevity, essentially. Is it better to leave on a creative peak, rather early in your career, or have that longevity and be performing as a band for, decades and decades, which is unheard of, really?
More. Give me more.
More is more?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll agree with him on that though. More is better. So in terms of album sales, you got Rolling Stones coming in with 240 million albums over 6 decades versus the Beatles with 600 million albums.
Didn't the Stones release more singles?
They both released a lot of singles. This kind of was the thing. But
if we're talking about number ones, Okay, we could talk about 72 songs
Objection, relevance.
on the U.S. Billboard chart,
Your Honor, what's going on here?
So,
including 20 number ones, 14 other hits that made the top 10. Stones have 56, lower than 72. They have 8 number one, hits with 15 other ones that are on the top 10. So that's also significantly less.
but you're kind of saying as if all those album sales occurred not occurred in the 60s only, but the Beatles had released and repackaged their material several times over the decades, and Beatles 1 and the Beatles Red and Blue Greatest Hits albums and things like that.
Correct.
I think Red and Blue was what my parents had.
Yeah.
I think I had that Pokemon game too. But you asked if it would be better to, have a short run and over the long career, and they're still selling these albums with their short run, and they're still amassing this, revenue.
But I mean, I guess ending on a relative peak. I mean, some people don't let it be the album all that much, I guess, or it was kind of a lukewarm reception at first. But
Right.
the Beatles, have a discography that's overall pretty untouchable in terms of there's not really a bad album, whereas the Stones have some bad albums, and then they generally have a comeback album.
Yeah, I can't
every
really
few
argue with
years.
that.
So
The 80s were not kind.
Oh, yeah, I mean,
so much.
yeah, they have plenty of bad albums, and I've heard every one. I mean, I love the band, but they have some bad albums.
I've heard none of them.
So I want to...
So,
if I can draw an analogy here,
Sure.
speaking of longevity. So I like that the Stones are still around, and their solo projects and the things they do together, still refining their sound, exploring in different ways. It's like if you see... Bob Dylan, who's been around, I don't know, is he like 80 years old at this point? I don't
he is 80. I think he turned 80 this year.
Jesus. And so what he's doing now is completely different from like what made him a household name.
Yeah.
And so I think that's great that, someone that has obviously such great musical talent can keep exploring and applying that.
Mm-hmm.
Granted, I mean, you're going to go to a Bob Dylan concert and it's great and it's novel because it's Bob Dylan, but and we're not going to sit here and pretend that it's, groundbreaking the way it was in the 60s.
Right.
At the same time, though, I think that to see an artist with such longevity to still be applying that creativity is something that, from a pure art perspective,
Right.
I like to see. And you see that in the Stones, because they've gotten back to their jazz and blues roots, which, again, I think is the whole... the main point of why I liked it is because they have some authenticity, some reverence for that, whereas... I mean, I'm not really going to listen to Wings or whatever it is if they're trying to get back to any Beatles sound.
I mean, so I guess I'm confused as to why the Beatles aren't authentic.
Are we going to start
Yeah,
back to them?
Oh, I mean, yeah, we can.
I'm just
talk
saying,
about that
like
now.
both these bands obviously have roots in, black musicians, blues and
Yeah.
jazz, but I couldn't have put in anybody. And I got a copy here. Our esteemed moderator had sent me this link from Scarufi.
Collusion.
Well, he sent you one for
is
the
a-
fucking Beatles, so this is fair. But in the basically, if, quoting Scroofy here, in those years, he's talking about around 1965, 66. The Stones didn't play songs; they shouted in people's faces. While the Beatles had tea with the Queen, the Stones were pissing in public. And so I think that if the source material here in jazz and blues has grit to it, has struggle, has strife, is not the sort of buttoned up sort of thing, that the Stones embody that, whereas the Beatles maybe tone that down a bit for a broader audience.
Which they appeal to. And I guess your argument is that because the Rolling Stones are this type of genre, they inevitably are better than the Beatles because they,
No, let's focus this way. We're talking on
this kind of
authenticity
genre.
here. It boils down to, can you really play jazz and blues if you weren't doing coke and heroin and having a lot of sex? I mean, Brian Jones fucks. Do any of the Beatles fuck like him? I don't think so.
So
I can't speak to that. Specifically.
He fucks.
I'm actually curious though if you speaking of Scarufi, did you read his review or discussion of the Beatles?
No.
Okay,
And I think
so
that's what we were talking about.
no.
Our mutual ignorance of each other's positions is really just
So
It's
adding
funny
fuel to
because
the fire
that
here.
would have given you more ammo because he does not like the Beatles.
Right, and that's
So
why
you
he
should have read it,
But
but-
still, he started
Would've
the
given you way
article saying that the Rolling Stones were just a piss poor band that was going downhill, that they had one album that saved them. That's how the article started.
No, this was the album from today from
The article
that I sent today from Slate. They weren't. No, they had so
he said they were on their downhill track. They had one album that saved them, and that even Mick Jagger said that they were lasting. They were going to last like what, 10 years or something.
they're gonna. Well, Mick Jagger said when he was 20, they were going to last.
In them.
They were going to last 2 years. But this is
Even worse.
and obviously they last 50.
Obviously, we exercise great
years.
judgment at 20 years old.
Right, and they asked it almost. I mean, they've been around for almost 60 years now. But the point of that was, again,
I
it was
made that decision when I was 20 years old. I guess that's why I became an attorney.
Oh, absolutely.
Just a side note, I think we can all relate to that.
We'll agree on that one.
Again, it was the 60s, and it was they released one bad album in 67 that would like kind of cut their career to a halt.
Yeah, wasn't it like if you didn't do something in 3 months,
I know.
you're like, oh, the Stones just hiding? Where are the Beatles gone?
And like 6 months later, you have they had their comeback album, which is Beggar's Banquet, which started this run of amazing albums, really, leading out of the 60s into the 70s. But I mean, let's go into like who is the better band by like maybe each component. So we kind of discussed lyrics, but which band has the better guitarist?
I mean, of course I'm going to say the Stones. But I think that the fusion of the rhythm and the lead section is something interesting. They're interlacing between the two. And I'm pretty sure there's some fancy Italian word to describe it, but you can have two guitarists that blend their roles as lead and rhythm. Some popular bands did emulate that.
I mean, the Beatles had that.
The Beatles do have that.
Yeah.
They didn't do it as well.
But
so I guess
you could easily win this one by just saying Keith Richards.
Oh yeah, Keith Richards, of course.
He doesn't know his name. So I guess going back a little bit,
it's the fusion
argument.
with Keith
The argument that I was getting is that subjectively, Pat likes the Rolling Stones better.
Do you subjectively like the Beatles better?
I objectively like them, and I think objectively, I think most
you just go to the
do.
top of the Billboard 100, top 60 only.
I think
top
all that
100 only for Lando here.
But so going to this question, I would say that each component of the Beatles is their own musician that holds their own. And I think that when anybody
you don't even like Ringo.
I don't. Here's the thing. This is what I'll tell you. I don't. Obviously, he's my least favorite part of the Beatles. As a drummer, I will say that I never really thought much of Ringo, at all. Like at all.
But as a songwriter, as a vocalist.
So one of the links that Mucci sent over a couple of days ago was like a TikTok video or something.
Actually, Pat sent that one.
Yeah.
Oh, so Pat, thank you very much, because this got me into thinking, maybe I don't dislike Ringo as much as I thought I did.
Yeah.
So the video was basically
maybe you learned something about yourself there.
I pretty much did, yeah. So the video was what the Beatles song could be with just a regular drum beat, which, from what I know of the Rolling Stones, it's just a straight rock beat throughout every single fucking song. So this video has him, this guy play. This guy plays a straight beat for whatever Beatles song, and then he shows you what Ringo does. And the more I was watching it, I was like, you know what, this is actually accurate. And the reason why I disliked Ringo to begin with was because I thought the beats he was doing were simple, which, they are.
And you play drums.
And I play drums, and I've been playing drums most of my life. They are somewhat simple, but they are not the go-to rock beat that you get with a lot of bands that were influenced by the Rolling Stones. They're not the, straight 2/4, just general rock beat that every single rock band will, have in so many of their songs. He's doing very creative stuff throughout. And this is what I'm saying about my least favorite Beatle. So I just think that individually, if someone thinks of both bands, they might be able to say something about Mick Jagger. Probably Keith Richards, unless you're Pat and just don't outwardly say that he's good at guitar. When someone talks about the Beatles, they will talk about them individually.
So there are kind of obviously there's 4 distinct personalities in the Beatles. And yeah, I mean...
Yes, there are 4 Beatles.
Right. Whereas there's
more people
like
in the Stones.
5 Stones, and then there's 4 Stones, and then there's 5 Stones again, and then there's, it's like...
and there's a different set of 5 Stones.
Right.
Yeah.
But
Does Mick Jagger actually play any instrument?
He's
sometimes
his voice
plays,
man.
Well, he sometimes plays guitar, but yeah, mostly vocals. And the Beatles was, obviously what's interesting about the Beatles is not only do you have at a certain point all four of them sing,
Right.
and all four of them write certain songs. Obviously, some more than others.
And all four of them play different instruments throughout.
Of course, and I mean that's true of the Stones as well. But with
Really, you find the outside of this Venn diagram, which we've completely failed to do because we don't understand any of each other's positions.
So with the Stones, you have every song is written by Keith Richards and Mick Jagger, and Mick sings most of them. Keith has one or two on maybe most of their albums, but mostly it's Mick is the front man. Mm-hmm. You don't have the kind of role switching like you have with the Beatles for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, in the different accompaniments, I know Brian was kind of like a virtuoso.
Yeah.
While he was in the Stones.
Right. Bringing in all these different instruments, like basically what George Harrison did with like bringing in Indian instruments. Like Brian Jones was kind of that person for the Stones, and was really creative in that way. So who was the better live act? I mean, the Beatles sort of famously stopped touring in, I believe it was 66 or 67,
Right.
but. Right, they were, obviously a great live band. The Stones continue to put on live shows, and probably are at a pretty decent peak of their live performances at this point. I think they've gone through ups and downs in the past, but I think if you go to see the Stones now, they're pretty consistent, and everyone knows all the songs. They're all good songs.
So you were chatting earlier. How many
live?
concerts had the Beatles played?
So I'll get at if you guys.
I'm gonna toss you the softball here because I figured what you had said
if the
earlier.
two of you want to agree that the Rolling Stones are better performers and that they're amazing live or whatever.
I don't need your scraps. I'll learn that.
You could chalk it up to them performing for 6 decades and just knowing their songs and performing for 6 decades. It's a lot of practice, but I will say that in those 6 decades, at least according to what I Googled and I found, they performed 2,000 concerts. And in a 4-year time frame, the Beatles performed 1,400 across the globe. So my contention is they were just tired. They were putting in work.
They just flew in and boy, there are.
Well,
and also, so from at least from the clips that I've seen, like video of them performing places, they kind of, I guess it's probably the same with the Rolling Stones, but the places that they played were just so gigantic, and they were not equipped with the type of equipment that they needed to be able to hear themselves.
Yeah, rock concerts actually were probably not that good until like the 70s.
Yeah.
Right. So they just didn't have the amount of equipment
when the Stones
to be
were
able
still playing.
Right, and that's why they're
took
said
that
to be the
medium
better
to-
bands, because they could actually hear themselves.
So you're saying a good band with good technology that kept touring can create an overall better experience.
Yes, if they
So
have
the
a lot
Beatles were shitty, and the Stones were good.
So the Beatles stopping touring.
Also, you can't see, but I am just kicking over here. We're talking about
He's doing
Rolling
the
Stones
Mick Jagger
live.
kicks.
You can't see them, but you could probably hear them.
Can we get some ASMR noise kicks? Can you hear the wind whooshing by Mucci's mic?
So the Beatles, stopped touring, not really because they were tired, but more so because they
I
couldn't.
think they were kind of tired.
I'm sure they were, but releasing 3 albums a year would do that to you. But that's what all the bands did back then, and making movies as well. But
Well, the Stones didn't release movies like that. So, I mean,
My point is,
You can hire any jamoke to make you a movie. But
Hard Day's
dancing
Night's pretty
takes
great.
actual talent.
So
You don't have the movies like the Beats. You got the moves like Jagger. That was rehearsed in the group text, by the way, but I had to get it in here. I thought I was being clever.
So the Beatles stopped touring, though, because they couldn't recreate their sound live because they were doing such experimental, different things in the studio and really playing with the studio space.
Correct, and the technology just wasn't there at the time for them. They weren't able to recreate it on stage because of what they had. They had these amps that just couldn't keep up with what they were doing in the types of places that they were playing at because there were so many people, and they just weren't able to keep up and be able to hear what they were doing while they were playing.
Well, you know what fans enjoy is being able to hear the band and see the band leader, up there giving kicks and strutting around.
I don't think
Just-
that's as
just
much of a flex as you
exuding-
think it is.
Just exuding sex
I don't think that's
on
accurate.
the stage. And I think that you can't have rock without this sexual element to it. Who ever got horny listening to the Beatles?
Have you never
No one.
seen any type of performance that the Beatles have done? Have you never seen the women that would go see the Beatles?
Yeah, they're paid
Like-
to go there. They're crisis actors.
Paid actors.
Like the whole thing, like, oh,
Okay.
the Beatles are coming, British
I think this is
invasion,
where we
women are
wrap
at
it
the airport. No, the fucking,
I think this is where we
tour
wrap
people
it up.
are just...
He's conceded.
Like legit though, when they like have the people at the airport like swarming the plane and shit, that's just like the promoters hiring people to come there. Like it's not authentic. I mean, I know the TSA didn't exist back then, but there's not people running onto the runway to go see some fucking kids in, bowl cuts.
All right,
Mucci.
so
Pause.
I don't even know how we got off track there, but let's go to my last question. You covered a song that you like the most lyrically, but what would you say your overall favorite, or even just say best, song by your band is, and how does it stack up against the other person's favorite song?
I can't get no satisfaction.
Okay, that's one that I could have named, and I don't know anything about them.
Um,
I can go with, we start with Let It Be, Hey Jude, Come Together, Strawberry Fields Forever, Something, A Day in the Life.
Okay,
Don't
we
Let
get
Me
it. You have
Down, In the
Wikipedia
Life, I Want to
open.
Hold Your Hand, Penny Lane,
was
All
the
You Need
task
Is Love,
not to
Get
pick
Back.
one?
So
This is what I'm talking about. You
That was
could
a-
ask someone for a ton of Beatles songs, and they will list them down for you.
Was that the question? List me as many Beatles songs as you can.
No, it wasn't. Well, pick one that is your favorite, and also why, not just name the
What's
song.
your favorite, Mucci? Let's flip this script.
Favorite?
Since you obviously know more about both these bands than we do individually.
Okay, favorite Stones song?
The silence speaks volumes from your mic, Lando.
Favorite Stones song is probably has to be "Gimme Shelter." At the end of the day, I think
Yeah.
it just is so kind of dark and epic, and it sort of sounds like the death of the '60s, which is kind of what it's about. And then for the Beatles, actually, it's not
If
one
you
of their
say
big
"Let
hits.
It Be," I'm gonna come
It's
across
not-
this table.
That's
my
not
fa-
even mine.
My
That's
favorite
not even
Beatles song
favorite.
is "Dear Prudence."
That's a really
Favorite
good
Beatles
one.
song.
I would say Eleanor Rigby is my favorite Beatles song.
That's a good
Really?
It's an amazing song, yes.
Yeah,
absolutely.
That's a great song. Well, I mean, I'm still in the kind of the position that they're both great. So someone convinced me otherwise in this closing argument here.
So if say you're in London, it's like 1965, you turn a corner, and there's a group of young British men in the alley.
Are they pissing? Because then that'd be the Rolling Stones.
I'm just
right?
saying, if you come to that alley
highly improper,
and you
Yeah,
see the
no.
Beatles versus if you see the Stones, which one's gonna scare you more? If you turn the corner and come into an alley, a dark alley, and the Stones are there, you're gonna be fucking scared. If you don't know who they are, if you just see those five guys, they're gonna be scared. If you see the Beatles, you're just like, oh, like, are you lost? Like, I'm sorry, can I help you? I'm just saying, it's this idea of the edge that the Stones have in every one of their songs. It's so raw. And while the Beatles, like in Let It Be and things like that, can definitely get sentimental, there's no denying that. I just think that why have something that's overcooked in the Beatles? We can have the real deal, with the Stones.
Generally I like that type of raw, edgy, gritty kind of band.
Like Blink.
Yeah, I mean, no, not like Blink. That's some pop punk.
We're gonna say that for another episode, right?
We're absolutely gonna. You know what? We were talking about this earlier. Part of the reason why I like the Beatles is because whenever you see them do an interview, whenever you hear them talk outside of their performances, they're very witty, they're very personable, they're charming. They kind of remind me of Blink, actually. So, if you've ever heard the Mark, Tom, and Travis show, it's nothing but, dick jokes, pretty much.
The Beatles are famous for their dick jokes.
I'm saying for the 60s, they were pretty close to it.
I just think it's silly if that, like, the most countercultural one of the Beatles is, like, John Lennon with, it's basically the Communist Manifesto, all this other shit.
Hey, that's Edge, man. That's freaking Edge right there.
So, like, one, from a literary perspective, completely misunderstood what the implications of the Communist Manifesto are. And two, like,
this is another
it's
debate,
hardly
too. This is-
revolutionary. He didn't do heroin, How are you going to have the fucking Edge if you're not, like, partying?
All right.
The
So
Beatles probably went to bed on time.
So, were you done with your closing, Lando?
No, I didn't even start it. So I guess in closing, what I would say is that, objectively, the Beatles are the better band. They've got, not only in sales, they've got it in just the kind of wave that they hit the U.S. with, the world with, that they're still kind of outselling the Rolling Stones, that, in social
from their
media
caskets.
that wasn't around back then, they're still outranking the Rolling Stones. And the Rolling Stones are around and can check their social media. So there's that. But objectively, I get the grit. I get that you like that they're edgy, but guess what? It's not for everyone. And that's why the Beatles outdo the Rolling Stones. Because they appeal to a broader audience. They appeal to way more people. They had better lyrics. Their band members were all recognizable in and of themselves. That's how I feel. I think it's just it's not really a debate here.
All right, I'm ready to make my ruling. I gotta be honest. The Rolling Stones are my favorite band of all time. I do love them. But I cannot imagine a world without the Beatles.
And no one ever should.
Counsel? I'm in the middle of my ruling.
There's that movie called Yesterday. Fantastic movie.
Where
the Beatles did not exist. And everyone was...
The Beatles win. You win, Orlando.
Thank you. I don't know what to say.
I move for a bad court
You get 1
thingy.
point.
Now, is that based on your prejudices yourself, or in any actual evaluation of what was
It's
discussed
not based
here?
on my prejudice.
I feel like we did nothing in either way to actually.
I told
impact
you.
the
I
ruling
said
here.
the Rolling Stones are my favorite band of all time.
We were massively underprepared for this debate. I mean, I didn't
This
listen
podcast in general.
I didn't listen to any Rolling Stones songs before this. I tried to listen to like 2 or 3, and I was like, oh, fuck this.
Yeah, that does conclude my ruling. It is the Beatles, even though I love the Stones. So that concludes this episode, our first episode, the Beatles versus Stones of OTR. Next week we'll be debating aliens versus ghosts, and
It's about to get spooky.
yeah, we recorded this one around Halloween, the day after Halloween, actually, right? Yeah.
Probably.
No,
So,
it was on Halloween. We were wearing our costumes.
Oh,
I'm still
Halloween?
wearing my
Sunday, yeah.
costume.
So anyway, that was our inspiration for a spooky topic. So not sure when this is going to get released, but we'll be discussing aliens versus ghosts in our next episode. See you then.